Good morning, students. Arkansas High School, APUSH history. Come on, let's hear it. All right. So this morning we're going to talk about the First Great Awakening, and this is not going to be necessarily a full lecture on that, but really just kind of a review. What you've got on your desk is a need-to-know handout that's available on my website. I have a website, tomrichey.net, and thank you for inviting me to your school, and let's go ahead and kind of go over what this is. Okay, now my point here, my thesis, if you will, the point that I'm making is that stimulus-based multiple choice questions, while they have a passage or some kind of graphic in front of them, it's really about what you know. You're still using primarily the skills that you, not so much skills, really the knowledge, and you're putting the knowledge together. They say skills, but it really doesn't take all that many skills to do this. It's a lot more about what you know. So first of all, if we were to ask ourselves, what was the First Great Awakening? What was the First Great Awakening? You're all going to hell! That didn't faze her. I think she's the Second Great Awakening terminology would be she's burned over. It's just she's been told so many times that it just doesn't even have an effect on her anymore. Okay, so what was the First Great Awakening? It was a religious revival, all right? When? In late colonial America. Now, what do I mean by late colonial America? As opposed to early. Like, if I'm thinking about the early colonial period, who are we talking about? 13 colonies, and even before that, like when you think about like French, Spanish, the Dutch, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, one year that's very important to know is kind of a turning point there in the history of colonial America. It'd be 1607, Jamestown, and you can kind of get into there with the 17th century and all that. Now, this is late colonial America. I mean, this period like right before the American Revolution, the French and Indian War. So this is really, when I say late colonial America, 1730s, 1740s. Now, it's very important on this exam. You don't necessarily have to know the day that stuff happened. As far as specific days, I think that if you've got July 4th, 1776 and December 7th, 1941, I think you're good. Other things, it's good to know when it happened. So 1607, the Jamestown colony. Now for other things, it's good to know the period. So in this case, 1730s, 1740s. This period immediately preceding the French and Indian War. Another thing we need to understand about this is we need to know that this is throughout the English-speaking world. So this isn't particular to one colony. This is in England. This is in the colonies. This is in New England. This is in Pennsylvania. This is in the southern colonies, all the way down to Georgia. So this is going on. If you note that it's going on not only throughout the colonies, but in England as well, then that's important too. Okay, so then finally who? There are two people that are important to know here, all right? Now, y'all might, is anybody taking AP English concurrently, like, or American literature? Okay, now, in American literature, y'all might have looked at a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Does that sound familiar? Y'all like, this is the fall. We went home for Christmas. We had spring break. We forgot all this stuff. My students do the exact same thing, okay? But, as far as that goes, that's why we review, right? So, Jonathan Edwards, okay? Jonathan Edwards, now you need to associate him with Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is a famous sermon that he gave. And the other person is, a lot of people say George Whitefield. Now, it's a written test, so often I say Whitefield because that's how it looks. So George Whitefield or Whitefield, however you want to say it, this is a guy who was from England, all right? So he was an English revivalist. And so as far as these movements go, typically knowing what happened, when it happened, where it happened, and who were a couple of key people associated with this movement. Now, as far as the key details of this movement, now there's something about American religion that's different from other places. If I were to ask y'all, what are the dominant religious groups in Texarkana, Arkansas? Like as far as,
Christian?
Well, Christian, but what type? See, in the United States, we have such a, about 70% of Americans are Christian, but there are so many different religious denominations today. So as far as, like, a type of church someone goes to, Baptist is very prevalent here, okay? So, and I would presume that there are also Methodists around here, okay? So Baptist and Methodist, these are both branches of what they call evangelical Christianity. And evangelical Christianity, why do I have this heart here? Why do you think? Like, when you go to church, what do they tell you?
Love.
Huh?
Love.
Love? What about love, though? Is religion... Now, here's the thing, that in a lot of religious traditions, it is a lot about the doctrine and what you have in your head, okay? But when it comes to, like, you go to a Baptist church, for example, which, that's one thing that's kind of distinctive. The First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening both result in more Baptists, which, if you look at a world map, Baptists are typically only prevalent in the United States or places where American missionaries have gone. And so if you go to Europe, for example, evangelical Christianity is really not, not prevalent. And so this is something, when you look at this, it is emotional religion, okay? So American religion, you might want to write that down, is one of the biggest features of a religion, a type of Christianity that in a lot of ways is distinctly American, is this emotional religion. So they're appealing to your emotions and your feelings, not really trying to convince you as much as persuade you. Now, what is the difference between convincing and persuading someone? If I'm trying to convince, what type of argument am I going to use? I'm going to use rational arguments, right? I will show you logic as far as, this, this, and this, and I'll try to get to your head. Now, if I'm persuading you, what am I doing? Your interests and your emotions, okay? So you see this emotional preaching, this revival type preaching, and that's where, when I was saying earlier, you're all going to hell, and that's the thing. They yell at you, and, have any of y'all ever been to a revival? Okay? They've got revivals in Arkansas, right? Okay, you've heard some revival preaching, and it is very, emotionally powerful, right? They're trying to get you to think, to feel that relationship with God, or particularly, perhaps, your lack of a relationship with God. So it appeals to the heart. It's very important. Now, this applies to the First and the Second Great Awakening. Very emotional preaching. Now, another thing is the arrow. Here's the thing, that, typically the preachers who, were residential preachers, they had their own churches, they didn't like opening up their churches. So these preachers tended to be itinerant, okay? Itinerant. Do I have, okay, I've got a board over here, it looks like, okay? So, now itinerant, it sounds like what? Oh, you got, is that maybe euro there? Awesome. Okay, I don't have a mark, but okay. So, okay, I will be right out of your way, I promise. Itinerant. Now, there is a word that sounds like itinerant. What does that sound like?
Ignorant.
More directly, okay, an itinerary. When do you have an itinerary?
We have like a schedule.
A schedule, and particularly, when do we tend to use that? Well, I don't know now, it would technically apply. You do have an itinerary for the day, but when we consult an itinerary, where are we typically? On a trip, okay? So we are on a trip. We are traveling. So itinerary, typically that is when you are traveling. And so an itinerant preacher, bless you, is a preacher that is what? That is traveling, okay? Which typically, when you have a revival, your own resident minister does not do that revival, right? Somebody else comes in and does the revival. Somebody comes in from somewhere else. So itinerant preachers. Now, another thing would be, why do I have a division sign? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Y'all like, it is early this morning. I tell you what, so nice of y'all to show up so early. Of course, y'all have to be here, right? Okay. But at the same time, it is early in the morning. Now, the division sign is because there were divisions about this. And when you think about it, I mean, religion, does divide people. There are some people who like a more traditional religion. Even today, like if you think about it, there are people who would like to have, I want, people that are like, I want the minister to wear a robe. I want it to be formal, that sort of thing. Other people like their religion less formal. Okay, so what you want to write down, a couple of vocabulary terms here, are old lights and new lights. Okay, so what do you think the people are who like this more emotional religion? They're the new ones, okay? They're the new lights. So the new lights, these are the people who are getting into this more emotional religion. Now, one thing to note about this, a lot of times the difference between the old lights and the new lights, like if you think about a church in your community that's a very traditional church, what might we say about the people who tend to gravitate toward a more traditional church? What kind of characteristics might you expect? Maybe older, but also like somebody who is like, would you expect to find like more money at the traditional church? Perhaps, like somebody who is more established a lot of times tends to like more established religions. And so what happened here is the Great Awakening preachers, they are, what they're doing is a lot of times they're stirring up the masses, the people who don't have as much money or education, and the people who are more established in the community, the old lights, they don't like this. In fact, we're about to look at a passage from Benjamin Franklin where he's going to go into that. So one of the big things is there's an increase as far as the consequence, an increase in religious fervor in the colonies. And what you want to note there is, Baptist and Methodist. And this is true for the Second Great Awakening as well. So before the First Great Awakening, what would you say of most colonists? Now, of course, in New England, what were they? These were... Oh, now here's the thing. Too early for Catholics. What was the first, now there are some in Maryland at the time, but what's the first, major wave of Catholics that comes into this country? Actually, that would be a much later one. So before the exam, you'll want to kind of just note your kind of an immigration timeline, okay? So at this period, during the colonial period, immigration, and remember this exam, like the multiple choice, a lot of times about these big ideas. So the immigration that's coming in at this time, like for example, my ancestors on my dad's side came in about this time. And they were Scots-Irish. Richey is a Scots-Irish name. And so those people were coming in there. And so mostly what you have here are the British Isles. The British Isles. What three places are in the British Isles? Scotland and England, Scotland, and Ireland. But particularly English and Scottish immigration and some German immigration. Now, is there anybody that knows you have German ancestry? Okay, now Germans just kind of trickled in throughout the whole period. Now if you put English and Scottish together, that's the largest immigrant group that's ever come in. But if you separate England and Scotland, people who claim their ancestry from there, German is the single largest ancestry group in the United States. But they're coming in kind of throughout. Now, the first wave of Catholic immigration, major wave, would be the Irish, and that was during the antebellum period and around the 1840s, 1850s. So we're a little too early for the Irish, and that's what people are going to note. You'll see on this one of the questions we look at there. So as far as that goes, we see an increase of religious fervor, and Baptists and Methodists, they are typically like what we call evangelical Protestantism, that are appealing to a more emotional religion. Now, before that, most people would have been Puritans, up in New England, or in the middle and southern colonies, Anglican, people who go to attend the Church of England. Now, if I were to, ask, like, there may be an Episcopal church somewhere in Texarkana, but it is probably not like a common religious faith around here. And typically, I would think that you do have more like established people in the community that attend that church. That is an old light church, that they have a very, like, typically in Episcopal churches, which are, you don't call it the Church of England anymore after the Revolution, but though that tends to be an old light congregation, whereas Baptist and Methodist tend to be more what? New light, okay? Now, non-denominational churches today, old light or new light? Well, new light because they're what? They tend to appeal to emotion, okay? So the thing is, what differentiates a new light is that they're appealing to emotion. Now, one last thing that I think is important about something like this is there was something going on at the same time. All right, and this is the thing, that not everybody is being swept up in this religious fervor. The concurrent movement would be the Enlightenment, okay? Now, the Enlightenment is kind of the opposite of the Great Awakening, because the Great Awakening appeals to emotion, appeals to your heart. The Enlightenment is appealing to what? Logic. Yes, you said rationality. That's actually what goes in this little blank here, the focus being rational thought, okay? So the people who are into the Enlightenment, they're not so much into evangelical Christianity, but a religion called Deism. D-E-I-S-M, which is like, now, for the Enlightenment, who would be some people that I might think of from the American Enlightenment? Well, now, John Locke would have been an influencer, okay, so you could mention John Locke was a highly influential philosopher. Now, John Locke was a Christian, but was not like a new like Christian per se. He was an Anglican. Now, but as far as in the United States of America, very good, okay, so Benjamin Franklin. Now, the way we can associate Franklin with the Enlightenment, what is kind of a detail about him? What did he do in his spare time? Science, and he invented stuff, which some people credit him with, he did some experiments with electricity. Some people credit him with bifocals. Some of y'all are going to need, after you're 40, you'll have, how people get out a pair of glasses sometimes to read something? And so the thing is, like bifocals, because people's vision changes. Now, Benjamin Franklin came up with this idea, like before, somebody would need 2 pair of glasses. And so Benjamin Franklin was like, well, you know what? Typically, when you're reading something, like if I'm looking at someone, I look here, but if I'm reading something, my eyes go down a little bit, right? So bifocal lenses, he's like, you don't have to take your glasses off. You just have to, you just have to look through another part of the glasses. So Benjamin Franklin, an inventor, was a man of the Enlightenment. Okay, very good. Now, 2 more that I would think about. The author of Common Sense.
Thomas Paine.
Oh, there we go. All right. Okay, so Thomas Paine, who was a big advocate of the deistic religion. Now, that's something that Franklin and Paine. Now, who is the most famous American Enlightenment guy? Guy that's more famous. Think about somebody more famous than either of these. With confidence. Where was that? Where are you? Huh? You were close. Okay, you're halfway there.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. Okay, there's an opening. He did that. All right. Now, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, now, Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, of course, with that, I saw APUSH memes posted like a thing where they were like, top 10 pranks of all time, and they had highlighted all men are created equal with Jefferson. Now, of course, his meaning in writing that was he was renouncing the British tradition of not only hereditary nobility, where somebody's either noble or they're common, but the other thing is that the British tended to see themselves as being better than Americans. And so, that's another thing. When Jefferson's saying all men are created equal, he's saying it doesn't matter where you were born, and it doesn't matter, whether you're in a noble family, that every person was created with the same human dignity and the same human rights. Bless you. Not necessarily that people have the same talents and abilities, but they have the right to be seen as equal under the law. And with that, so Franklin, Paine, Jefferson, and knowing that it's about rationality, and remember that the religion of Deism, okay? Deism is, this religious movement that's really basically, it's noted on what you can prove. Because here's the thing. If somebody looks outside and you see trees, I just breathe air, everything, I've got a temperature that's comfortable for me. Now, does that necessarily prove that there's a God? No, but could I rationally come to the conclusion that there is a higher power that created things? Do I need the Bible to come to that conclusion? No. So that's deism. Now, Jesus Christ, died so that I can have eternal life. Can I know that just looking out there and experiencing nature? No, I have to look at a sacred text. So deism rejects sacred texts and focuses on natural religion. Now, when I say concurrent movement, were the same people drawn to the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment? No, not at all. Okay. So with that, we will now look at a few stimulus-based multiple choice questions. And thank you so much for doing this. And for those of you watching online, I've got a stimulus-based workshop and that sort of thing that you can purchase. And I'll put a little link in the wherever. You'll find it in the comments, in the description, and all of that. It's always a pleasure.